Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. We are honored, really, to have two incredible people here on the stage, plus me. So, Yanti Saripto is the head of Save the Children USA. She's been in the SAVE community for about 15 years, roughly, and spent a lot of her career at Unilever, Kimberly-Clark, and a real expert in delivering real services to real people. So we're going to have this conversation today about the global impact on kids and what Save the Children is doing about that. And we're equally honored to have Christina Shapiro from UNICEF USA, who spent much of her career at Goldman Sachs, running an amazing project for 10,000 women. It's a fund that they've had. And now is the Chief Sustainability Officer with UNICEF USA and runs two impact funds and an impact fund and a bridge fund as well. So we're going to kick this off with Christina, who is going to chat about some recent research they've done in the space and with youth and families. And I'll turn it over to you, and then we'll have a Q&A.
Thank you. Great to be here and great to continue the conversation we started this morning, and honored to be on a panel with both of you. So the research I wanted to share is called Learning Interrupted, and it talks about the impact on disruptions in schools to children all over the world as a result of climate action and climate activities. And so I think somebody said it in this morning, the climate problem is a problem of today, it's not a problem of tomorrow. And that is very, very, very clearly evidenced through the statistics that I'm going to share with you. So the research that we did showed that last year, in 2024, 242 million children had their schooling interrupted or disrupted. Now, that can mean a variety of things. It could mean that the school day was cut short by 2 hours. It could mean that their schools were destroyed and they couldn't go back. This is a new term that I learned. The schools were preponed, meaning vacation started earlier than expected, or the school year started later than expected. But all of this is disruptive to children and impacting their ability to acquire the learning that they need. And that happened across 85 countries. And as we saw this morning, while 74% of that is happening in low and middle income countries, it's happening here in the US. It happened in Europe last summer. We saw it through the floods. It's impacting children everywhere and disrupting education everywhere. And the reason that UNICEF is so concerned is, on its face, it's concerning already, but there was already a learning poverty crisis. And I don't know, how many of you know what we refer to when we say the learning poverty crisis? Some of you. Well, what it means is that 70% of children today can't read a simple text by the age of 10. 70%. Those are children that are going to school as well as children that are not in school. So that shows that there's already a lack of acquisition of key literacy and numeracy skills. And when you have climate crises exacerbating learning, well, that's incredibly concerning. And that's coupled with the fact that there's teacher shortages and crowding in classrooms. And the other piece of information that we know is that this impacts girls more than boys, unfortunately. So all children are impacted, but girls are disproportionately impacted. And the longer they're out of school, the more likely it is that they won't return to school. And we know that when that happens, gender-based violence and early child marriage goes up. In fact, we see a very quick and direct impact of child marriage rates going up whenever there's a significant climate crisis. So very, very concerning. And if that wasn't enough, certainly 242 million is already staggering, but 1 billion children, which is half of the world's children, are in high-risk countries that are at a very high risk for a climate event. So those are some of the stats that I just think are worth putting into context. And then this map really shows you where are those children being impacted the most, and what are they being impacted the most. And the most prevalent type of climate event is heat. And I think a lot of you probably know, but especially younger children are really incapable of processing heat. They don't sweat, their body temperatures rise very quickly, it impacts their bodily functions much quicker than an adult, so they're bearing the brunt disproportionately vis-a-vis adults. And so we're seeing that happen in many places. I think it's the sign with the thermometer on it. And then the area that is being a region that's being most impacted is South Asia, with 128 million children impacted just last year. So this is really, really disruptive in many levels. It's disruptive to the child because they can't go to school, and it impacts their safety, not just their education. It impacts the communities because there's a loss of facilities. So when the schools are shut down, the learning doesn't happen. But often, if the school is the one facility that did survive, that is where families are sheltered. And so that has a double impact then on education, because you can't continue to provide education when families are sheltering in the schools. And it has impact on society, and it puts a lot of stress on the caregivers, the parents, the teachers, and the caregivers in those communities. So there's a triple impact as a result of these climate events on education. So that level sets a little bit of the research. What have we learned as UNICEF in providing holistic responses to climate events and education and children? So I would say, let me highlight quickly. I know that we have a lot to cover, but 3 ways that we show up and what our holistic approach includes. And the reason that it has to be a holistic approach is because if for children to be ready to learn when they go to school, you have to make sure that they have access to nutrition, clean water, and shelter. And all of those are impacted with climate events. So the first thing is that UNICEF is typically in disaster zones before, during, and after an emergency. And one of the areas that we focus a lot on, and I'm sure Yanti will corroborate this, is nutrition. It's hugely important. We use 20% of the calories we consume every day to power our brains. And so if children are not getting the nutrients that they need, they are showing up to school already with difficulties in terms of processing information. And we know today 45 million children are already suffering from severe acute malnutrition. That is impacting their cognitive development. It results in stunting, which means that they're small for their age. And that has repercussions not just in terms of their cognitive development, but it impacts their earning potential over their lifetime. So being there and providing nutrition is really important to ensure access to learning before, during, and after a crisis. The second thing is we strive, and we do a lot of this in partnership with SAVE, to ensure continuity of education even when disasters strike. UNICEF responded to 450 emergencies last year. And one of the ways that we help ensure continuity of education is through a partnership with Microsoft's Learning Passport. And it is a curriculum that is customized and localized to local languages. It is accessible offline so that schools and families can access it through apps and browsers when the schools are closed or if the children have to stay home. And I was just in Zambia a few weeks ago, not in the context of a climate emergency visit, but visiting a school for children with learning differences, and they were using the Learning Passport for a classroom with hearing impaired children, and those lessons were also being sent to the families through SMS at no cost, so that they could continue their lessons at home. So really, really valuable. And then the third thing is about building resilient infrastructure. I mean, we have to build back greener, safer schools and health clinics that are climate resilient, and I'll talk more about that later. But we also have to think about financing innovation and how we crowd in private capital to cover some of the costs and to build back more resilient facilities. So very quickly, one example of where we're seeing a significant impact of these types of climate disruptions is Mozambique. And for those of you who may not know, it has a long coastline on the western part of the Indian Ocean, which is very cyclone prone and has been impacted by 5 cyclones in the last 6 years. And Cyclone Freddy, for example, beat the records in terms of both the duration and strength of speeds, destroyed schools and clinics, caused the cholera outbreak to rise 3-fold. So one of the things that UNICEF has done in Mozambique is to rebuild over 1,100 classrooms in a climate resilient way. So foundations that are more elevated, more durable materials, roofs that are detached from each other so wind speeds can go through the different facilities rather than pulling the roof out. And that has benefited over 230 schools. And we've also locked in some type of innovative finance called the Today and Tomorrow Initiative, which I'll talk more about, that is providing funding both before and in response to these emergencies. So I think I don't need to tell this group, but I mean, these are photos of after Cyclone Idai in Mozambique. I mean, how do you get to school when this is what your community looks like? And, I did the wrong thing, sorry. And I think not surprising that from a UNICEF perspective, climate is absolutely a child rights crisis. So let me stop there.
Thank you, Christina. And you've talked a lot about how climate change is impacting UNICEF's work and your prescription for solutions. I'm going to turn to Yanti. How is do your experiences parallel those of UNICEF, and how is SAVE's work being impacted by climate change?
Yeah, I would completely recognizable those pictures. I'm like, yep, I've seen those. I've been there. Exactly the same. I was in DRC last year, Democratic Republic of the Congo, and again, a lot of these countries are overrun by a multitude of by polycrisis, as we know. So yes, there is conflict. There's conflict because everybody wants to get their hands on critical minerals in eastern DRC. I was there. There were 120 armed groups in the hills around Goma, and we literally saw shelling happening from one side of the mountain to the other, and the displaced people, mostly women and children, were essentially stuck in the middle. And at the same time, so we were working there. We were doing an emergency response, making sure that children continue to have access to education, even though they were displaced and in a camp. And then we were driving to another place, and we were literally driving through water that came into the car via the windshield wipers, via the windshields, because Lake Tanganyika had been completely overflooding for the last 3 months, which again I think was the longest continuous flood over the past sort of 20 or 30 years there. So we were driving through. There were boats coming by with people trying to get to school and to do their shopping. So again, even in everyday life, we see a constant, even though we're there to do sometimes an emergency response for conflict, sometimes longer term development work. We were running an amazing education program there to actually make sure that children who were in school were actually able to read and write at the right age, grade level. But then at the same time, this flood happened, so you have to adapt your work because that is what the situation requires. So you have to constantly, I think, have your knees bent in terms of what you do, because you can have nice plans, but this is what we're going to do, here are the schools that we're going to reach, etc. And then, of course, as always, life kicks the plan in the teeth because the schools are all of a sudden flooded or no longer there, but then you still need to find a way to reach those kids and help them.
So, I mean, this is an interesting question. It's getting to Arnold's 7 Ps this morning. But we just had these wildfires in LA, which are just devastating. It's like a war zone for those of you who have seen it.
Yep.
A carpet bombing, it looks like, which LA was unprepared for. So you do a lot of work in so-called disaster relief. What is the balance of disaster relief and planning for these crises as they get more predictable with this extreme weather outcomes? Yanti, you go first, and then Christina, please, as well.
Yeah, it is a great question. And look, I think, isn't it that they say 50% of all humanitarian crises are sort of predictable? Now, you can be surprised. Sometimes you get the country or the region in the country slightly wrong, or the timing. But by and large, we have enough data and science that help us understand much more so than even 5-6 years ago. You can prepare for food insecurity, for famines, for failed harvests, for droughts, for prolonged drought situations. And we also know that preparedness is more effective, more cost efficient, prevents unnecessary suffering instead of responding to when it has happened. We also know that there's been 4 years, it's been much harder to get attention and funding for doing preparedness, because then the child is still smiling and they're not starving. It is a brutal truth that it is much easier to fundraise for starving children than it is for children who are not yet starving but could be in a couple of months' time, right? And as an economist, it is beyond belief that we are so wasteful because this world, I always think my parents could say, well, children are starving because that's the way, the world doesn't have enough food or money or knowledge to make sure that every child thrives, but that is no longer the case. There are enough calories produced on this planet for every single man, woman, and child. There is enough money. There is certainly enough science and knowledge out there to prevent that. The children who are starving today could be saved by giving them therapeutic food, essentially fortified peanut butter. It's a cheap product. It costs between $50 and $60 for 8 weeks, and the child, it is like a miracle intervention. And it is low cost, super effective, massively researched, and it is available. So there is no excuse for us not to be responding more in terms of preparedness and building resilience, rather than just rushing in to essentially try to put out the fire, as we tend to do.
Yeah, so maybe this is a good time to talk about the Today and Tomorrow initiative, because I think so Today and Tomorrow is an initiative that UNICEF launched precisely because we want to both prepare for, and we know that with every dollar of disaster risk preparedness, you can save $15 in post-disaster response. So it's highly effective, right? Very economic decision. And so it's creating plans that ensure that there's preparedness for what will happen in an emergency, early warning systems. You can use satellites to look at the water levels and see if drought is coming. Prepare, great. But we know, because of research and data, that climate disasters will strike. And so the Today piece is allocating some money for the preparedness. And then the Tomorrow piece is a partnership with the insurance companies, where if certain climate disasters like cyclones occur, there's prearranged insurance for certain climate-related events that hit a certain level that unlock funding in 72 hours. And that's because we know that $1 today is sometimes more important than $100 6 weeks from now. And so the goal of the Today and Tomorrow initiative, it was a pilot to provide this type of funding early on, and then in response to cyclones to 8 countries. Mozambique was one of them, Bangladesh, Haiti, Vanuatu, a couple of others. And it did result in insurance payments of $4 million to 4 countries, where the funding was triggered in 72 hours and benefited over 300,000 people. And so I think we need to do more of those things, because we can't just have the funding mechanism and the insurance that kicks in, because if we're not doing more of the Today piece, fewer insurance companies are going to want to come in, and we want to scale this to a $100 million platform that is reaching more countries and is more responsive. But we also have to invest the dollars back to creating these schools that are solarized. And I was really pleased. I went to Zambia. Most of the schools I saw had solar panels, and that powered water pumps, and that were taking rainwater and harvesting it, and had green spaces and trees that were protecting from wind. So you need to do both.
Well, Today and Tomorrow is, sorry, Yanti.
Well, I just wanted to on that. I'm always shocked by the statistics that our water and sanitation experts give me, that essentially they say something like 40% of schools have no access to clean water. And particularly for the women in the room, you know what that does. If there is no lavatory, if there's a toilet, what that does to girls, because it means they could miss up to 40 to 50 days of school when they have their period. So to run schools or health clinics without access to clean water, and that is exacerbated by the climate crisis, by increasing weather events, that also then prevents good education and good healthcare.
Yeah, so I'm going to, in this very serious topic, I have a little bit of light fare. I would come down to this campus when I was a kid growing up here, and there's Felix Chevrolet across the street, if those of you have seen it. And there was a guy who would be on the TV every single day saying, let's talk about cars, right? And when he wasn't doing that, it was, let's talk about trucks. This was burned into my skull at a young age of 4, on and on. So now let's talk about partnerships, okay? So let's tell us, please, each of you have been very innovative about partnerships and the power of that in this era that we're in now, where we're seeing severe government cutbacks in the US and most likely in Europe. How are you looking at partnerships as a growth engine, and how do you see the private sector stepping into these kinds of investment vehicles? Bigger question. So, Yanti, you want to go first?
Sure. And there are some really interesting examples. So can't remember who mentioned it, Laura, I think, early this morning, nature-based solutions. So a lot of companies do feel and actually budget for things like carbon offsets. Now, there's always a bit of a debate. Are they real? Are they good? Which ones are good, which are not? But there are good schemes. So Save the Children is now essentially implementing a program where law firms pooled their carbon offset budgets that they had in their budget applied. So it wasn't even incremental grant money that they had to find in their foundation or anything, which is usually, not that sustainable. They said, okay, we need carbon offsets. Save the Children designed this program with local communities, the national government, the local governments, to help this region that was suffering from deforestation, massive deforestation for years and years has been ongoing, eroded soil, etc. Help them reforest this land, make sure children and communities are leading that process, so that we actually build something back that the community wants, that they can have a livelihood around this. I think it was a tea plantation that they want and need, making sure that children are not caught up in that value chain. And at the same time, that work creates, that reforestation creates the carbon credits that the law firms, who are all in the UK, now have to make sure that they can offset their what it is that what they need. So again, and it creates a multi-year revenue stream for that community that they then have the ownership of and are empowered to use in the way that they see fit. Better education, better healthcare, etc. So again, small example, $5 million project over 5 years, and in the initial stage, a lot of work to put it together. 8 law firms needing to agree on something, the design, the communities, make sure the governments are all in agreement, the community leaders are in agreement, make sure you can track it and measure it. But if that works, then you create a real sustainable flywheel for a community and allow the private sector to also reap the benefits of it.
So maybe I'll talk about a very different type of example, and that is a program that's called Skills for Girls that UNICEF launched with 2 private sector partners, Chloe and Clé de Pau. And it's a program that's aiming to provide girls in particular with green skills, STEM, social entrepreneurship, digital tech skills. And the reason that we launched that is that we know that one of the key things that youth and children have told us is we are very anxious about climate and the impact of climate on our future, but we're also optimistic, right? The percentage of youth that are pessimistic is lower, but the gap between those that were anxious and that were active or doing something about it was pretty, so 60% are anxious, 17% were active about it. And what they said is, we need help. We want the help of others to show us what are the skills that are gonna be needed for the future, what are the jobs that we should be preparing for. Give us examples of what other youth are doing in communities to motivate and inspire what we could be doing, because that is going to give us the hope for the future and bring the change that we want to bring. So that is an example. That partnership is in 20 countries and is aiming to reach 10 million girls, and we're very much on track to achieve that by 2025. So that's an example of, for us, leaning into youth and partnership to equip our youth to make the change they want to make in their communities.
Great. Well, that's a perfect segue as we round the bend here. This is a Planet Media conference, and you've got a lot of professional storytellers out in the audience. So as people who run these 2 incredibly successful NGOs, what request do you have of this audience here that could help you as you try to achieve your ambitions?
I would say really help young people tell their story and bring them to life. I mean, most of the countries where Christine and I go, actually the majority of the population is under 25. And yes, we work with children, so you tend to see, yes, very young children and young adolescents, and they are incredibly, yes, optimistic, but they're also eager to take charge. Save the Children has been working with campaigners, young campaigners, across a multitude of countries. We call it the SHIFT initiative, and they campaign. We give them a little bit of training, a little bit of seed funding, but these guys are super digital anyway. And they decide what they want to campaign on. And a lot of them do want to campaign on the impact of climate change in their own communities. They want to talk about the floods. They want to talk about how to build back resilient schools and buildings and whatnot. And once you give them that little bit of spotlight and you let them go, it is quite extraordinary what these guys achieve. So to all the storytellers here in the room, give them the mic.
So I love that. I think that is exactly right. I wanted to share a bit of how we're doing storytelling and would love ideas, and you can help us. But I don't know how many of you remember this box, the Trick or Treat for UNICEF. Awesome. I'm seeing a lot of nodding heads. Well, good for you. I grew up in Mexico City, so we didn't have these. But every time I tell somebody I work at UNICEF USA, when are the boxes coming back? Well, they're back. Okay? They came back last year, and they're back. But the reason I'm mentioning this is that these boxes debuted 75 years ago, and they really were instrumental in helping young kids begin to be young philanthropists. And it was often, not always, but often the first time that kids were creating connections with kids in other countries. And at the time, it wasn't as digital. Now we have digital storytelling. So when these boxes come out, there's a QR code, and kids can click into that, and they could follow the example of Ari, which is a 6-year-old in Jamaica that is accessing these digital textbooks for children that are hearing impaired. And so they could meet Andre, who is a Ukrainian refugee that was resettled with UNICEF's help. And that is critical because it creates empathy, it creates a shared humanity, and I think we need more and more. I think I shared earlier, part of the challenge that we're facing today is a lot of people don't understand the impact of foreign aid funding cuts because they don't know what it means to them. By storytelling, through children and youth, you could start to understand that those children aren't that different. They need the same things, and hopefully we can drive towards more shared accountability. So if you can help us do that and give us ideas, we would love that.
All right, trick or treat boxes for everybody.
When they come out.
Okay. Finally, in 2 words, other than terminate pollution, what motivates you to act on climate change?
Yeah, and everybody says they do it for their family, and that's true. But I would say future potential.
Every child.
Wonderful. Let's hear it for Yanti and Christina. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.